I'm just waiting for it to say okay. Okay, so today we are finally covering the second last unit because Mandy had asked us to do LU2. No, what is it? LU3, LU2, yeah.
It was 3, yeah.
No, 3 was bricks, wasn't it? I think it's 2. Okay, the post-development one. But today we're focusing on learning.
Oh, yes, it's 2. It's 2, yes.
Yes. Okay. So today we're doing LU7, Adapting Development Initiatives to Climate Change. I think I need to admit somebody. Okay, so we are going to be looking at the politics of adapting to climate change, the local adaptation to climate change, and I guess that's about it. So it's the politics of adapting to climate change and the local adaptation. However, we are quickly going to look at assessment 7, the assignment question, so that as we are reading through the study guide, we are actually going to be trying to answer this question as well, and we're going to be making mental notes of when it's becoming political and when it's becoming an economic factor, you know, and also when you're picking up adaptation and mitigation strategies, you know. So assessment 7 reads as follows: discuss the political and economic factors surrounding climate change. Also, discuss adaptation and mitigation strategies adopted to deal with climate change, especially in the global south. Refer to the case studies and recent climate change agreements in your answers. So it's very important for you to be able to answer this assessment according to what I've seen, the scope of it. Okay, so you need to Google the latest publications about climate change, books and climate change. You have to look for sources, extra sources. And then also this study guide, unfortunately, does not cover, no, it does mention Chatterjee, but you need to read the Chatterjee. It doesn't tell you to read Chatterjee like the others or read Lin Yang EL. So you need to be focused on these 2 articles after. And so basically we're looking at 2 very big things, which is the politics of adapting to climate change and the local adaptation to climate change. And that brings it to the close of the chapter, basically. So after this unit, we should be able to debate the dynamics and risks surrounding major climate change, and we should be able to outline the politics surrounding the climate change and development. And then we should be able to discuss environmental reasons for current concerns about adapting development initiatives to changing climatic conditions. And then we should be able to discuss case studies on adapting to climate change in the development initiatives. And here we start. So the introduction tells us that climate change has become increasingly important in recent years, not only for governments and international bodies, but also for those dealing more directly with economic and human development and human security. Then there's a growing consensus that we're entering a human-made era of global warming, and there's a widespread experience of unusual and extreme climatic conditions. The key environmental issue is how to reverse global warming and stabilize climate patterns. So I think that's mitigation, basically. What do we do with farming, for example, in the Western Cape in conditions of extended dryness or drought? What opportunities are there for cold countries that now have regions with longer summers and milder winters? There's an example here of China that you're going to pick up that talks about how they are benefiting from the climate change because they've gone from cold to warmer, and now there's like this increase on their crop yield. But that's like one case. And then it says, how can we adapt local and national initiatives in changed climatic conditions? So it tells us that in recent years, a vast amount of literature on the topic has emerged. This is partly because it has become a feature of the discourse of global institutions and discourses theory, and as such, it is connected with major research and project or program funding. The literature is also a response to the growing sense of urgency in response to both environmental and institutional dynamics. Books have appeared, such as those by Muna Singh and Swart and Lowe, which consider the issue in relation to Africa. So now what is happening with global climate? In a study by New EL, or 2011, they argue that it is very likely that the global temperatures will rise by at least 2 degrees Celsius, more than during pre-industrial times, and may even rise by 4 degrees Celsius. A rise of 4 degrees Celsius will have major and probably catastrophic impact on agriculture and coastal cities, and will result in the destruction of ecosystems, example the coral reefs, the dieback of forests, the melting of permafrost in Canada and Russia, resulting in faster warming and chaotic changes in the water systems in many parts of the world. So the first activity told us to go to New EL and read page 6 to 13, and then we were supposed to describe the science on which the argument is based on and why the authors believe the objective to limit the global temperature rise to 2 degrees will not be met, and the consequences of the rise of temperatures by 4 degrees Celsius. So basically, I took those pages and I tried to highlight what I thought was quite important from each page. So I broke it down each page and I took out what I felt was important. So in the first page, it tells us that the 1992 UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which aims to stabilize greenhouse gas concentrations to prevent dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. The 2 degrees Celsius global warming limit was proposed in the late 1990s as a guardrail to avoid most dangerous climate impacts. And then it tells us about the Copenhagen Accord, that the increase in global temperature, so they were debating that it should be below 2 degrees Celsius, and then they told us that the severity of impacts calls for renewed efforts to reduce emissions and focused research on climate system behavior under plus 4 degrees warming, its impact and adaptation strategies. Then from page 7, I took that the 2 degree target was adopted by the European Union in 1996 as a pragmatic choice based on limited studies and became a benchmark for climate policies. And then I also highlighted the Copenhagen Conference, highlighted tensions between scientific knowledge and policy decisions, with leaders expressing frustration over the difficulty of achieving agreement on temperatures. And then on page 8, it was, I highlighted the Rogalj argued that developed countries would need to cut emissions by up to 80 degrees below 1990 levels by 2050 to have a 50-50 chance of staying below 2 degrees Celsius. So basically, he's arguing that it's basically the fault of the developed countries are contributing, and to this whole mess of climate change, and that they need to cut emissions by 80% so that, they don't rise. And then here it says Bowerman EL emphasizes the importance of cumulative carbon emission budgets. That's like your economic factor, showing that 1 trillion tons of carbon from 1750 to 2500 would likely result in a 2 degrees peak warming. They also highlight the challenges of achieving emissions profiles that fit with the budget, concluding that staying below 2 degrees is virtually impossible and 1.5 degrees Celsius is unachievable. And then on page 9, Bowerman again discusses emission floors, noting that the current methods of food production generate greenhouse gases that are difficult to reduce, which affects the rate at which the temperatures decline from their peak. They also highlight the importance of peak emissions in determining warming rates. Then they give an example, and then they speak about faster warming rates have significant implications for adaptation and mitigation efforts. And then they mention Betts EL explores high-end warming scenarios, showing that most climate models predict a 4-degree warming by the end of the century under business-as-usual emissions, with some models reaching 4 degrees Celsius by 2061. And then page 10 talks about the spatial patterns of climate change in a 4-degree world are discussed. Then they start telling us that the land areas will be more warm, oceans, land areas will warm more than oceans. Land areas will warm more than oceans, with high latitudes experiencing amplified warming due to snow and ice albedo feedbacks. And then the precipitation patterns will change, with arid areas becoming drier and moist tropics and mid-latitudes becoming wetter. So the spatial patterns have been described here very nicely, and then they've used a nice example in page 10. And then the other one speaks about the sea level rising. So they're very descriptive on page 10 about what will happen. And then page 11, it discusses the impacts of SLR under scenarios of protection and no protection. And then it speaks about, you see, there's another economic factor here, because it says for a 2M SLR, annual cost for protection could reach $270 billion, with many nations at risk, particularly in the South and Southeast Asia. So I think it's quite, this article does have a lot of economic pointings to it. And then on page 12, it talks about Smith. The Smith article discusses adaptation challenges in a plus 4-degree world. They highlight the need for flexible and robust systems to address poorly defined future climate scenarios. And they also discuss the psychological, social, and institutional barriers to adaptation are exacerbated by uncertainty and long time frames, immobilizing decision makers. And so a 4-degree world would require greater long-term financing for adaptation, with estimates ranging from 40 billion to 170 billion annually. So this article is very good to answering the assignment. As you can see, it discusses the economic factors, backing up that it's going to be more expensive if things don't get done. Okay, and the last page from the reading was telling us about the lack of binding agreements at Copenhagen has shifted focus to non-nation state actors such as cities, local governments, private sectors, and individuals. Cities responsible for a significant portion of global emissions can contribute to mitigation and adaptation efforts. Examples include London and Los Angeles, which have committed to substantial emission reductions and developed adaptation plans. And then states like California have adopted ambitious emission reduction targets and regional carbon markets. Major corporations are also reducing emissions through corporate social responsibility and market incentives. And then tells us about the NNSA actions alone are insufficient to avoid 2 degrees or 3 degrees warming. They can help reduce emissions. Yeah, you just have to read this, but know that there's a lot of economic stuff. And then 7.2 is the politics of adapting to climate change. So Richard outlines the engagement of global institutions with the issue of climate change. So now he tells us about the different agendas of the North and the South. So in global forums, namely the North's interest in emissions and other mitigation targets, and the South's insistence on redistribution or compensation, since climate change is mainly caused by the industrialized North, and 97% of deaths from natural disasters between 1990 and 1998 occurred in the global South. Richard then outlines the global funding mechanisms and the various ways in which poverty relief and equity can be tied to the concerns of these global climate initiatives. So now we're moving to the local adaptation to climate change. Remember, there's only 2 major sections in this specific module. So a lot of your understanding is going to come from the e-reserves. Okay. So the next section is local adaptation to climate change. Yaman, Rahman, and Huk have attempted to develop a conceptual framework for prioritizing the poor while addressing climate change. They do this firstly by using the perspective of vulnerability. Who is the most vulnerable to climate change? The second step of their approach is to focus on community-led adaptation. The authors consider ways in which relevant policy processes at different levels could include such community-led adaptations, more likely how policy processes may continue to exclude community voices. So these guys have brought in the human element in their argument, you know, placing the vulnerable first. So now it tells us, read Yarman, EL, and summarize their arguments on the relation between community adaptation and policy. So I think that one would have to be done by each individual person according to how they would substantiate their argument. But I did a summary on that paragraph on the community-led adaptation. And then it says that the LCA project focused on the second strategy, which was the adaptation, with the focus on adaptation efforts led by communities affected by climate impacts. Definitions of communities tend to center on whether people are subject to a local administrative unit or belong to cultural, ethnic, or regionally defined groups. We defined the concept of community by reference to people subject to a local administrative unit because the focus of the LCA project was on how different groups of people at different scales of governance might organize around climate impacts and be supported in their proactive efforts to adapt in respect of a common climate impact or threat. By focusing our definition of community on regions where the groups of people identified themselves as sharing a common climatic past and future destiny, we were able to examine many different kinds of communities of relevance to climate policy, ranging in size from a few hundred people to several million. And then they tell us communities are not homogeneous. Sharing climate impact or threats does not imply that each member of the community is affected in the same way as all the others. Whether small or large, communities are highly differentiated in terms of access to resources and factors such as age, gender, class, and ethnicity. And these differences are highly significant to the vulnerability and adaptive capacity of particular individuals. Where possible, LCA case study authors have tried to highlight these differentiations, but more detailed work on understanding intra-community vulnerability dynamics is something that will have to be taken forward in other projects. And then they share rationale about their analysis, or they substantiate the argument, telling us that first, human societies have adapted to climate variability and other changes for millennia, and much of the knowledge is embedded in the fabric of social structures operating at the community level. This knowledge is highly relevant for climate adaptation and provides an important supplementary source of expertise to the information generated by more formal scientific institutions and processes. Second, understanding and strengthening the agency of communities is imperative, as much adaptation will be undertaken at the local level. Unfortunately, national and international policy are not good at reaching the poor and vulnerable, and when they do, tend unhelpfully at times to plan interventions for communities instead of supporting initiatives. Okay, then it shares the assumptions. I think you'd have to read this all by yourself, right? But I'm going to skip this. That's for me. That's for when, if I feel like reading further. So in that article, basically you just have to read that one and make notes yourself, because it's quite catchy for me to briefly summarize it, because I didn't spend enough time on it. However, I'm willing to reread it. In a study on response to drought and wind erosion in Senegal, Sek, Mahmouda, and Wade, that's another article that you're going to have to read for this assignment 7, show how a pilot farm introduced forestry windbreaks, alternative fuels, drop irrigation, and the planned selection of crops to meet the demands of the urban market. Even though this pilot farm is portrayed as a great success, the study shows the predicament that Senegal faces as a result of changing climate. Okay, so this is a case study example article, and then there's another article that you're supposed to read, and this this is another study about water issues, and then they discuss, so it says, in another study in water issues, Chatterjee and Das discuss community adaptation to drought in Rajasthan. That's, I guess this is an Indian case study, so it's Senegal and India. In the semi-arid northwest of India, the study shows that the severe effects 7 years of drought had on agriculture, employment, food security, and livestock. The authors outline how, in response to the drought, a number of traditional adaptive behaviors were used, such as changes in cropping, storage, and animal husbandry practices, and the introduction of new technologies and practices. So this article is telling us basically how they responded, adaptation strategies. So if you want to answer that, mitigation and adaptation strategies, this article definitely has an adaptation strategy. And then the other study is in a contrasting study. This is the China that I was talking about, that they are benefiting from the global change. It says here, an area in northern China which may benefit from global warming is considered. Recent years have seen a prolonged growth period, a northward movement of accumulated temperature belts, and decreases of cold stress. Northeast China has responded through readjustments of crop composition and structure, enlargement of sown areas, and the adoption of advanced technologies, which over the 20 years between 1982 and 2002 have resulted in the rise of 155.7% in total grain output. Okay, so China has had, is this an adaptation? I think this is also another adaptation strategy, because it says Northeast China has responded through readjustments of crop composition and structure, enlargement of sown areas, and the adoption of advanced technology. There we go. Adaptation strategy number 2. So the activity on 7.3, I fortunately could not, I don't know if somebody accessed it, but I couldn't access it. So I left that blank. And so now we move on to another section, which tells us that these contrasting studies illustrate the different environmental consequences of climate change, but also the different national and institutional settings. Senegal being a poor country and China a rising economic giant. Okay, that's also quite nice that you put it like that. It is also noteworthy that China seems to have had an autonomous national response to an aspect of climate change, whereas the initiatives in Senegal aim to link up with UN processes and funding. So China is like independent, and then Senegal is still dependent on the West. So that's another pointer. A more recent case study emphasizes the trade-off between immediate interests and long-term climate strategy, and the maladaptive choices that can be made by local communities in their responses to climate change and socioeconomic stress, such as overfishing. This is the Zanzibar case study. So yeah, the Zanzibar case study, as overfishing increased driving distances to the fields and the intensification of child labor in Zanzibar. For these authors, policies on, for example, cooperatives, the management of the Zanzibar shoreline through coastal zoning policies and improved education, facilitating a variety of livelihoods, are essential for enabling ordinary people in terms of adaptation and mitigation of climate change. This is a great case study for adaptation and mitigation, the Zanzibar example. Okay, so here it tells us to read Suckle, and it says, on the study of trade-offs in Zanzibar, and review the content on the coastal livelihoods in Zanzibar, and summarize the barriers to maximizing adaptation, mitigation, and development. Oh, okay, this article is self-explanatory. Well, the title, the abstract will tell you everything, and synergies in response to climate and socioeconomic stress. So I copied and pasted the abstract exactly as it is. And then it tells us, in this paper, we examine how communities in Zanzibar cope with and adapt to multiple stresses, including climate change, and how these responses affect long-term adaptation, mitigation, and development goals. In particular, we identify the multiple stresses that affect natural resource dependent communities in Zanzibar. We then explore how community responses affect long-term development and mitigation goals before we examine the barriers of maximizing AMD synergies in community responses. We use the drivers what's going on here? I think it's drivers pressures. Sorry, I think this is just from copying. Drivers, pressures, states, impacts, and response. Sorry guys, I'm just fixing this document. We use the drivers, pressure, states, impact as a response as a tool to organize the complex information relating to both the marine and terrestrial SES in Zanzibar. Using data from household surveys and community level focus groups, we find that responses to stresses resemble coping strategies as they provide short-term relief, but in the long term may negatively affect development goals. Furthermore, responses generate a trade-off between adaptation, mitigation, and development. For example, when farmers respond to low productivity by spending longer on the farm, there is a development trade-off as time burdens are increased, and a mitigation trade-off as secondary forest cannot be established. We identify that AMD-compatible responses are constrained by resource, regulatory, learning, and governance barriers. Okay, the barriers are also included in this article. We conclude that without local climate policy intervention, maladaptations which threaten both mitigation and development goals could occur across a range of temporal and spatial scales. So I now basically tried to find out how this question could have been answered with regards to the, let's go back to the question. Sorry, I just want to scroll back. It says here, read Suckle obtainable on the study of trade-offs in Zanzibar and review the content on the coastal livelihoods in Zanzibar and summarize the barriers to maximizing adaptation, mitigation, and development synergies in response to climate and socioeconomic stresses. And so it says here, Suckle shows that community-level adaptation responses in Zanzibar are strongly shaped by multiple stresses, and these responses often create trade-offs between adaptation, mitigation, and development. Their study identifies three major types of community responses. This is relocation, extensification, intensification, and diversification, and explains why these often become maladaptations rather than sustainable long-term strategies. Firstly, the authors show that many community responses resemble short-term coping strategies, not true long-term adaptation. Relocation and extensification, such as moving farms and forest collection areas further from the village, help households survive immediate stresses but generate negative development impacts, including increased conflict over land, longer labor burdens, and greater vulnerability. These strategies also undermine mitigation goals because extensification accelerates deforestation, fuel wood extraction, and carbon loss from soil and vegetation. Another thing they point out is that intensification of farming and fishing is widely practiced, with farmers working longer hours and drastically reducing fallow periods. While this increases short-term production, it does reduce soil fertility, which worsens the environmental degradation and increases the time burden on women and children. I think because the women and children are the farmers in this, well, they help a lot in the farm. This leads to development trade-offs such as reduced school attendance and long-term decline in yields. Mitigation potential is also lost because shortened fallow periods prevent secondary forest regeneration, reducing carbon storage. All of this stuff is actually taken straight from the article, which is why it's showing PDF. Thirdly, while livelihood diversification offers some economic benefits, especially through tourism, it also brings new social tensions. For example, men entering traditionally female activities such as octopus collection, which threatens women's income sources. Diversification into tourism is also indirectly carbon intensive because the tourism sector relies on high emission international travel. Thus, even diversification creates adaptation, mitigation trade-offs. And then finally, Suckle identifies several barriers that prevent communities from adopting climate-compatible AMG-friendly strategies. There are resource barriers. These are such as lack of boats, gear, irrigation, fertilizer, or post-harvest technologies. There are regulatory failures. This includes weak fisheries enforcement and poor control of tourism impacts. There are also learning barriers, which includes limited technical knowledge or access to extension services, and they have governance barriers such as weak institutions, lack of coordination, and unresolved user conflicts. These prevent communities from shifting from maladaptive coping to long-term sustainable adaptation. Overall, this article demonstrates that without targeted policy support, community responses to climate and socioeconomic stresses will continue to generate maladaptation, worsening environmental degradation while undermining both development and mitigation goals. Okay, now we're hopping into another case study now of desertification in the Cape Verde Islands. I know this article was not available in the link, so I had to look it up myself. If anyone would like this article, you just have to tell me you're looking for the Taveras article and I can send it to you on WhatsApp. So this article emphasizes an approach that includes all stakeholders in strategies to combat and mitigate desertification. They claim that through highlighting each stakeholder's knowledge and experience, the group can assess, identify, and test sustainable soil and water management practices. So this article is got a lot to do with stakeholders and also help resolve conflicts between interest groups, for example, farmers and cattle raisers. So it says here, read the article, which is located, and then this article claims to be based on global best practices. In the light of both this case study and the big future challenges of climate change as outlined by New EL, briefly describe whether the inclusive stakeholder method outlined in this article is a model that can be used at any level. Okay, so in this article, according to a summary, I Googled the stakeholder method in the article, which for me is basically what they're asking you to describe. So it says here, the article emphasizes the importance of a participatory stakeholder method in addressing desertification in Cape Verde. The stakeholder method integrates local knowledges from farmers, land users, and local organizations with scientific expertise from researchers, policymakers, and rural development technicians. This approach ensures that solutions are tailored to the specific socio-economic and environmental context of the region, fostering collaboration and ownership among all parties. The stakeholder method is structured into a 6-step participatory process that facilitates the appraisal, selection, implementation, and evaluation of sustainable land management strategies. This model is designed to engage stakeholders at every stage, ensuring that their knowledge, experiences, and priorities are incorporated into the decision-making process. So the summary also helps us now to break down the 6-step. Please, guys, whenever I read a summary, I'm going to say it again. Make sure that you go find it in the article and reference it so that you're not plagiarizing. because Copilot will flag you instantly and you can get a 0. So the 6-step stakeholder model, the step 1 talks about socialization and identification of land degradation causes. Then they explained that there's a 3-day workshop which was conducted to introduce the Desire project to stakeholders and identify the main causes. The step 2 was a study of key indicators of land degradation, and then it explained that it was adapted from a medalist model, and then it speaks about data sets, etc. I'm not going to read everything here. Step 3 talks about the selection of mitigation options, and yeah, you just have to read all of that in the article. Step 4 was the implementation of selected options. 5 was evaluation and monitoring, and the other one was dissemination of results. So remember, we're doing this is the inclusive stakeholder approach or participatory approach. So now key features of this model. The features are that it's a participatory process. So this model actively involves local and external stakeholders in all stages, from problem identification to implementation and evaluation. It has integration of knowledge, so it combines local experiences and scientific expertise to develop tailored solutions. It's got decision support systems, which facilitates the evaluation and ranking of mitigation options using quantitative criteria. Talks about a multidisciplinary collaboration, which engages a diverse group of stakeholders, including farmers, NGOs, policymakers, researchers, and technicians. And then it talks about scalability. This model is designed to be replicable and adaptable to other regions and countries facing similar challenges. So the stakeholder method is presented as a dynamic and effective tool for sustainable land management, emphasizing the importance of collaboration, education, and empowerment in combating desertification. Okay, so I'm just going to read only this paragraph, just of this, and then I'll move to the next section. So basically, a summary of the article is this article addresses the pressing issue of desertification in Cape Verde, a phenomenon that significantly impacts rural communities by depleting material and environmental resources. Desertification in Cape Verde is driven by a combination of indigenous factors such as manual agriculture, deforestation, land tenure issues, and steep slopes, as well as exogenous factors like high rainfall variability, climate change. I know this is scary, né, guys? It sounds scary because it's just complex, but you know, God will help. Prolonged droughts and heavy rainfall. These challenges have led to soil erosion, water scarcity, and socioeconomic vulnerabilities, particularly in rural areas where agriculture is a primary livelihood. Okay, so basically it tells us where the study is located. It's located in Santiago Island, and then it speaks about the 6 steps, and of which you will find them. And then it highlights the importance of participatory approaches in addressing desertification. By involving local stakeholders in decision-making, the methodology ensures that solutions are tailored to the socio-economic and environmental context of the region. This approach has shown promising results, including reduced soil erosion, improved vegetation cover, increased crop yields, and enhanced food security. However, the authors note that the successful implementation requires a well-trained team, sufficient financial resources, and effective collaboration among stakeholders. How the article ends is it concludes that the participatory approach is a dynamic and replicable tool for sustainable land managers, and it emphasizes the need for integrating local knowledge with scientific expertise to develop effective strategies for combating desertification. The authors recommend scaling up the approach to other regions and countries facing similar challenges, with a focus on empowering local communities and fostering collaboration in various stakeholders. So that was the article by, I forgot the name, but you guys will see it in the activity. Okay. Now we move on to, oh yeah, it's Tavares. So now it tells us that both Sacco, EL, and Depina Tavares advocate a strong governmental role in local adaptation and mitigation. Yet these are discussions of local strategies. Is this all making sense in terms of, I can see now in the article how, because it says discuss the mitigation strategies, the adaptation. So these guys have the mitigation strategies. The other one spoke about the participatory, inclusive participatory approach, which can be used in the assignment. And then SACO also has something very valid. And then it says that yet these are discussions of local strategies. Now, how are broader issues such as large-scale migration from coastal and increasingly dry areas to be managed? The adaptation and mitigation strategies discussed in New EL, you might need to go back to New EL and find out what those strategies are. Indicate the need for international, corporate sector, national, city and local strategies on issues including coastal flooding, overpopulation in river basins, and the destruction of ecosystems such as coral reefs. Yet they also argue that our lack of knowledge of the scale of future global warming could lead to well-meaning yet inaccurate strategies of adaptation and mitigation. So this is nice. This is a nice little thing when you're concluding, to say that, our lack of knowledge of the scale of future global warming could lead to well-meaning yet inaccurate strategies of adaptation and mitigation. I think that's a good getting to the end of your essay. And then it says responses that might be most appropriate for a +2 degrees world may be maladaptive in a +4 degree world. This is particularly an issue for decisions with a long lifetime. Examples are the placement of reservoirs or even relocation of towns. New EL are thus clear that alongside a societal shift towards adaptation and mitigation, there is an urgent need for ongoing research into climate itself, into the costing of various environmental changes and initiatives, and into new technologies such as geoengineering. Okay, and then it tells us to read New EL again. We have to read it again. This is the second time we're reading it. But now it tells us to make brief notes on the mitigation, which are actions taken to reduce or prevent the emission of greenhouse gases and to limit the amount of future global warming options outside of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. So, this exercise, the reason why I set it up like this was I decided, okay, cool. So in an essay, for example, if we had to do an essay that has to do with this, the mitigation, etc., how would you go about actually using these areas of articles? So I know that what you're looking at is not what I'm going to be speaking. I'm going to be adding a lot of my revelation alongside it. So if you want to write a good essay, this is just general, okay? You're going to have to extract direct evidence, okay? And from that article. So first you need to look for the themes within that article. What themes is each of the articles I'm reading addressing, right? And then you need to have a direct evidence from that theme. So you need to paraphrase it. And then you need to show this critical understanding, not just description. And then you must connect scientific findings to whatever the topic is. So for instance, it says to achieve a distinction level, you must show deep understanding of the article, demonstrate critical thinking, use specific evidence and quotations, structure your answer logically, write with clarity and insight. So, like I said, we're just using this as an example, but this tip goes for the exams that we write, all of them. So we read the article with a purpose. You don't have to read every sentence. Focus on the themes. So you're going to highlight the the different themes. Now, you must look for sentences that explain the point of the paper. And then you choose highlights from that article. And then, yeah, highlight very important information. And then when you are reading, try look for the effects, the pros and cons for each article, especially if you're going to have to substantiate, you know, like here they say look for the effects. And then basically, if the article compares situations within the article, try and use it in your essay. So if it compares two different things, you know, if the author argues and he's comparing two different situations, also try and use it. You know, this is what it's saying if you want to do very well in an essay. But this is all contextual. And yeah, basically, you can use real world implications or real world examples when you're writing. And then at the end of the paper, you can highlight, it says you can highlight, like, for example, here in this paper, you know, you need to be able to conclude, like I showed you how you would conclude that essay by writing that point that's specifically pointed at, and then you conclude it powerfully, and then obviously you would take information that you've already written and summarize it, and then that's it. And I think, yeah, the secret to a quality essay: state ideas in your own words, support it with a quote, and explain why it matters. So you always state, you support, and you explain. If it's a discussion, that's something else you can take. And how you build high quality answers is you always have a clear structure. You use evidence from different articles, and you show your understanding and analysis. And you end with original insight. And then, yeah, I think basically we are done. So what I did do was I noticed that there's a lot of articles for assessment 7, and one of them was the 4 degrees and beyond. So what I did was I decided that, okay, whenever I look at an article now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the name of the article, and then I'm going to take the keywords of that article, and I'm going to put it within that author. In my e-reserve summaries little booklet that I create. That way I understand that, okay, cool, this article is going to address adaptation. So I know that I can trust this article if I need to look at adaptation. I don't know if you guys understand what I'm trying to say, but I think if you have a piece of paper with all the e-reserves, and then you take the keywords, you'll be able to locate that specific section, you know, to help you to give meat to your answer. So yeah, I'm not gonna read this. I'm not gonna read from these notes, because I think each person, whoever wants to take on this topic, should just read. Let me see what this is. Sorry, let me see if this is going to be helpful. So this is the 4 degrees beyond. Okay, that's the 4 degrees and beyond. That's one of the big themes of the actual study guide. It talks about that 4 degrees thing. So this article has everything, or a lot of information about the 4 degrees, that the potential consequence of global warming reaching 4 degrees above pre-industrial levels. It has a lot of the 2 degrees target as well. So yeah, just be wary, guys, when you read an article. Here it talks about geoengineering, mitigation and geoengineering. That's geoengineering would be an adaptation, because you're adopting something new. So it's also a strategy, mitigation and geoengineering. And then I'm just trying to look at Yeah, you guys won't understand these notes because they're personal notes. So can I just see? Okay, so in concluding here, this learning unit, so this learning unit tells us that there's a crucial debate on climate change with the focus on adaptation. It focuses on the politics of adapting to climate change and the local adaptation to climate change. And it tells us that after having worked through this learning unit and read the recommended material, you are expected to outline the debates, dynamics, and risks surrounding the major climate change. You are also expected to outline the politics surrounding climate change and development. Furthermore, you are expected to be able to discuss the environmental reasons for current concerns about adapting development initiatives to changing climatic conditions. Finally, you are also expected to be able to discuss various case studies on adaptation to climate change in development initiatives. So you guys know those case studies. It was Senegal, it was China, it was, there's another country, there's 2 more countries. There's like 4 case studies here. And then that brings us to the end of the meeting. Now, let's just give opportunity for anyone who wants to discuss something. It doesn't have to be related to here. It could touch on something else. But I think we all now will decide if, okay, we can grasp this topic or not. Like for me, it takes a lot of reading, you know, and I'm more comfortable looking at the first 4 LU 1, 2, and 3, and 4, so than the back ones. And that's just from my personal perspective. Does anybody else want to add something? I just want to stop the recording. Please, guys, let us discuss. We have